excited to bring on our guest speaker for today. Jay is the founder and principal of Alumni Identity fundraising consultants, and he has a really awesome intro slide himself. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll let Jay come on screen and share a little bit more about himself. Hi, Jay.
Thank you, Marcia. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me 1 second here. All right. Okay, so let me get a thumbs up that some people can see this screen. Okay.
We can see it.
Well, it's nice to be with you all this morning, and thank you, Marcia, for the opportunity to talk about something that is both a personal and professional passion of mine, and that is cause-based identity. If you're not quite sure what that means, we'll get into it a little bit later this morning, this afternoon, whatever time you may be giving to us today. First of all, welcome to my bedroom here in sunny San Francisco. It's just a beautiful day to start the Thanksgiving week, and so I want to start by expressing my thanks to you who are in the nonprofit and higher education space for everything that you've done over these last 18 months to really make it possible for students to continue their pursuit of an education and for us to do the social work that we need to help fix some of the fabric of our nation that's been so torn over this last year and a half. So thank you for what you've done. And let's get into a little bit of a conversation today. So first and foremost, I want to ask you to just pay attention to this slide. And if you will, pull out your smartphone, grab an image of this QR code, or go ahead and go to the URL and put in this code here. This will allow you to participate in a few of our upcoming slides. So you want to go ahead and do that right away. So the topic for today is accelerating philanthropy through cause-based identity. Say that 10 times fast. Basically, what we're going to try and do is unpack the intersection between data science and social psychology and what it means for giving us a new lens into the donor psyche. Okay. So here I am with my son, Alex. I like to introduce myself sort of by the identities that I hold. So I'm a redhead. I'm a father of a redhead, a social scientist by training. I'm executive director of alumni relations for UC Berkeley, and I'm also the founder of Alumni Identity fundraising consultants. So this little guy, it's actually his last day of being 3 years old today. Tomorrow is his 4th birthday. He was born on Thanksgiving morning in 2017, as my former boss and good colleague, Jessica Jordan, who's on the call today, will remember when I called her and said, Jessica, I'm on my way to the hospital. See you in a month. Okay, so the first little audience participation thing here, I want to ask you, what identities do you hold? So let's just think about this as broadly as possible. I shared a few of mine, but if you would just through the Slido app, tell us in a word or two, what are some of the identities that you hold? And go ahead and put as many in as you like. And let's just take 30 seconds to do this together. So going in there and putting in, maybe it's father or mother or churchgoer, basketball player, but let's put in a couple of these. Okay, this poll should be active. So is anybody having trouble doing it? Okay, good. Let's pop it up now. All right, community builder. I love that. That's a great identity. And if you don't feel comfortable popping it in the survey or you're having trouble with that, you can throw it in the chat too. But just looking for the different ways that you think about yourself and the identities that you hold. All right, folks, we got 29 people in the room here. I'm hoping that we're going to get a few more of these. There we go. Entrepreneur, son, Jewish. It's great. Sales professional. All right. Friend. Some other things that that people often put in, we can name father, son, daughter, sister, brother, all of these familial identities, best friend, BFF. Okay, Armenian. Yeah, a lot of basketball lover. I'll join you there. I'm very excited about UCLA's basketball season, which was my undergraduate uncle. The funny uncle. Oh, that is so true. I bet you. Gay. Okay. Yeah, that's a big identity, isn't it? Okay, so let's pause there for a moment and let's just reflect on what the categories are of the types of things that we've all shared here. So interesting that all of us on the call presumably have some role in fundraising or community building or alumni engagement or donor engagement for the purpose of a cause. But doesn't look like anybody put causes in here in particular. I think we have a few, certainly related to nationality, religion, orientation, but we didn't put things in here like, the name of your alma mater is a big part of who you are. So that's part of what I want to dig into today, is how all of us are in this business of trying to raise support for a cause. But sometimes when we think about the identities that we hold, we don't necessarily first think about the causes that we care about. All right, I love the nerd too. That's great. Okay, so let's keep going here. So let's talk a little bit about identity. Why is identity important? Well, as I mentioned at the outset of the call, the social fabric of our nation has really been torn over these last 18 months or so, not just by the pandemic, but by racism, anti-Blackness, and all of these things that have brought to the fore this concept of identity. And more often than not now, I experience meeting people for the first time and they start to share with me their identities. Just think about how many times you're in a conversation with somebody where they share their pronouns, or perhaps they share something else about them that's important for you to know. So I think I don't have to explain this too much, hopefully, but the way we view ourselves, the identities that we hold, they influence every decision that we make. The company we keep, products we buy, certainly. And what we're going to talk about today is how they influence the charities that we support. So here's a question. How much of your self-identity informs your philanthropic contributions? So how many of those things that you all listed, how do those actually inform when you open your wallet and you make a gift, especially this time of year? So the big idea that we're going to talk about today is that the identities that donors, members, subscribers, alumni, they create with the institutions and causes they support, that's really ground zero for two things: for measuring their engagement with a given cause and predicting their future philanthropy as well. So that's the idea that we're going to do. So I'm going to take you back for a second to maybe a Psychology 101 class that you may have had in college, and invite you just to close your eyes for a second, see if you remember this foundational social psychological theory called role identity. Now, this is a really old in the sense of social psychology, from the 60s onward, of trying to understand the way we view ourselves as humans. And the basic idea is that our identity is made up of the roles that we occupy. So some of the things that we just talked about, being gay, being Jewish, being a basketball lover, being somebody who is a sales professional, all of those different things. Those are all roles that we occupy in our life. And I put up some of the theorists here in case that's of interest to you, and just to show how sticky this theory has been over time, and then ending with my own research in 2017. So the basic idea here is that if we think about being a donor as an identity among the identities that you all listed, then your donor identity, it would be a measure of how much of who you are is related to any given cause. So how much of me is related to the Sierra Club probably informs how I respond to the Sierra Club when they send me solicitations every year. Okay, so here's the next participation piece. I want to invite you all to think about a cause, something that is part of who you are, is part of your identity. And I'd like to ask you this simple question and respond just once. Overall, how connected do you feel to the Sierra Club? Do you feel to your alma mater? Do you feel to any other nonprofit or social cause? So let's just take a moment there and again, how connected do you feel to the cause? And don't overthink it. Pick a cause that's top of mind and just tell me, how connected do you feel? And thank you, everyone, by the way, for participating. Okay, we see some more coming in. Let's give everyone a chance. The poll should be active. Thank you for the comment in the chat. I'm sorry if it's taking a minute for folks to get to it, but if you're not able to complete the poll, just think about this on a spectrum of 1 through 6, very disconnected to very connected. And just remember your response. How connected do you feel to the cause? Okay, thank you for the responses so far. Looks like we've got 9 eager beavers that are jumping on this. So just remember for a minute how you responded. Were you very disconnected, somewhat disconnected, somewhat connected, or very connected to the cause that you were thinking about? So just keep that in mind. Hold on to that for a minute. Okay, we got some more responses coming in. So we've got a lot of people who feel connected, some who feel disconnected, some very connected. So if you were to imagine this as sort of a bell curve, that's what we're seeing here. All right, let's keep going. So part of the research that I started back in 2017 was to understand in particular, how does an alum's feeling of connection, how is that related to, if at all, to their expressed support behaviors like volunteering or giving? So what you're seeing here on the slide is a sample from some research that's been going on since 2017. This in particular is from about 8,700 alumni survey respondents across 3 liberal arts universities. And so we can see here on the vertical axis is the average annual gift in total made over 12 months by that individual who's reporting a certain level of connectedness, as you just did, on the horizontal axis. So in the research, we can see that the connectedness level is very highly and positively associated with an increase in annual giving. So perhaps not surprising, but what's interesting and fascinating to me as a researcher is this just based on one single question. We're not looking at anyone's giving history. We're not asking people questions about how satisfied they are with anything, but just that one simple question that we asked you, overall, how connected do you feel to your alma mater? And it turns out people who report feeling connected or very connected are much more likely to give and at a higher level. So now I want you to remember for a minute where you were on the spectrum of connectedness. So what did you respond to the cause that you were thinking about? And I want you to look over at the donor amount, and I want you to think, how did Jay do here? Did he get close to how much I donated last year? Was it way too high or way too low? And if you could just take a minute, look at that. Too high, too low, or about right? And would you let me know? And let's have a conversation about it. So how accurately did your level of connectedness predict your giving on that last slide? Well, we've got one person says about right, too low, some too high. Let's keep it going. It's part of the honest vulnerability of being a researcher is the opportunity to get some immediate feedback. Welcome, Gina. Apple and peanut butter. That's what my son eats for breakfast too. Okay, cool. All right, let's keep it going. See how people are answering. So it's about right. Oh, this is cool. Too low. All right, I understand. Too high. Better to be too low than too high, I suppose. But it looks like for about 50% of you, the prediction was, it was about right. So think about flipping the coin. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So bringing us full circle here, we started by talking about identity, the identities that we hold, how that figures into social psychology and the degree to which you think about yourself as associated with the cause. We asked a simple question about your level of connection. Then we made a prediction based on some ongoing research that my group was involved in. And then we asked you simply, how did we do? About right, too low, or too high? So sometimes when you're talking about a new concept, at least this is true with my soon-to-be 4-year-old, you sometimes talk about it from the other side. So what is identity? Well, it is not a couple of things. So identity is not satisfaction. Just for example, a lot of us probably are asked in surveys all the time how satisfied we were with something or might be with something. That really doesn't get to our identity. And neither do things like net promoter scores, which is a measure of loyalty, or affinity itself, or pride. And you might say, well, Jay, what do you mean? These are words that we use all the time in the nonprofit and higher ed space. We're always talking about donor loyalty. We're always talking about affinity. We've been told to use a net promoter score in every survey that we do. And how can you not ask people about satisfaction? Well, the point I'm trying to make here is that identity, that's who you are. Satisfaction, your loyalty, your affinity, your pride, those are all things that you have. And by definition, if you have something, that means you can lose it. So for me as a researcher and as a fundraiser and engagement professional, I'm much more interested in understanding a constituent's level of identity with the cause that I'm trying to support than I am whether they're loyal to it or they have pride in it. So your cause-based identity is part of who you are, it's part of who your donors and supporters are. It's something that you inhabit, it's created over time. So you're not going to lose it the way you lose satisfaction or lose loyalty with the football team, for example. So in terms of philanthropy, as we saw in the previous slide, if you could measure someone's level of identity and measure that level associated with a cause, that could be a very powerful thing. And at least for some of you here, for 50% of you, we were able to predict about right how much you donated in support of that cause last year. So here's the point. We don't want to look at things that fluctuate over time. We want to look at the core part of who our constituents and supporters are. We want to begin to measure that and leverage that in our fundraising activities. So the way that I've been doing this in the context of higher education is through something called the Alumni Identity Score. And this takes the concept of identity that we've been talking about and just breaks it down for higher ed in two important ways. So the score itself, it's a single score. And within that score, it's two things. It's a way to quantify and measure someone's level of engagement and also to predict their future giving. So it's much more than just that one question we ask, but it's a methodology of asking questions of donors and alumni constituents to try and identify ideal donors in the future. So I still get tongue-tied talking about this sometimes, and I've been talking about it now for 6 or 7 years. My friend Kelsey, who works at USC, I always try and give her credit because she said, Jay, just tell people that it's like a 23andMe score for alumni engagement. And she's right. That's what this alumni identity score is. The way we get at the score is through a methodology and questionnaire. I just wanted to share with you some of the questions that we ask. because I hope that these are very different than some of the questions you ask in your alumni and donor surveys. To get at someone's identity, there's really three dimensions to it, according to role identity theory, which we talked about earlier. So one is, how salient is that identity for the individual? And that's by asking a question like, agree or disagree? Being an alum of my alma mater is something I often think about. And then social perceptions is the second dimension. So to what degree would the people around your Thanksgiving table say that that cause is important to you? And then the third is like the peer component of identity, which is, to what degree do you feel like you and other alumni like you are supposed to help current students? And when you start to build this three-dimensional view of constituents, you start to get a very clear idea of their identity and how much of who they are is related to their alma mater. So if you want to try it, you can. I set up a quick 2-minute demonstration questionnaire, which you're welcome to use and share. You can access it at score.alumniidentity.com. All right, so let me just pause there for a second and catch up if there's any questions in the chat. All right, nothing. So let's keep going. I'm eager to get to your questions at the end. So just a little bit of a teaser. We've talked about how you can use a identity score like the Alumni Identity Score to predict philanthropy. Well, you can also use a score like this to get at a couple of other things that are really top of mind for a lot of us as we go back to some kind of different normal in the post-pandemic era, at least in higher education. One is, how do we recruit and retain volunteers, and how do we engage with alumni through digital engagement? So as it turns out, the Alumni Identity Score, which is up here on the vertical axis, and volunteer opportunities on the horizontal axis, these two things are related too. So not only is an identity score related to someone's level of giving or the amount that they give, but it's also related to another important support behavior, which is volunteering. And then I think all of us have been thrown into this world of digital forward engagement and are probably asking questions about which digital engagements actually increase the level of connection that our constituents feel for their alma mater or for the cause. And so in doing some of the research here, looking at event attendance, liking a Facebook post, and becoming the member of an official LinkedIn group, it turns out that those last two digital engagements lift someone's identity with the cause almost at the same level, slightly higher than event attendance. So let me say that another way. It turns out that if you are trying to influence the way a constituent identifies with your cause, it is equally worth your time to produce an event as it is to create a social media strategy on Facebook, to create and invite folks to join an official group on LinkedIn. So for those of you who are budget-minded and think about resources that go into either an event or a digital engagement strategy, I hope the wheels are spinning a little bit now and thinking, if I can influence someone's level of connection for my cause through a digital engagement at the same level as an event, I could reach far greater numbers of people at a much lower cost. This particular study was done with 12,000 undergraduate and graduate alumni across several liberal arts universities for this time. Okay, so as we wrap up the presentation part of this, if there's anything that I want you to take from what I've shared today, it's this fundamental idea that identity is about who donors are, and that some of the things that we measure and talk about a lot, affinity, pride, and loyalty, is something that our donors have. And if they have it, again, that means they can lose it. I don't see folks losing their identities anytime soon. So I want to share a few resources for you as well, and for the purposes of the recording. So don't feel free to take a picture of this if you want, but we'll share out the recording afterwards. So I've got a blog that I write every once in a while. It's going to become harder. We're expecting a baby girl here in January, so my time will be taken up a bit differently. But I really tried to bring into that blog some conversations from colleagues that are doing interesting work around identity also. I've got a great Salesforce connection with an ebook that we produced together on the 3 massive myths of fundraising. Also a great podcast I did not too long ago with Oregon State University. I also want to invite those of you who are in higher education to join this community of practice that I and several colleagues created at the beginning of the pandemic. This was really to bring together practitioners to do some webinars and workshops. We've got over 3,000 members of this community now, and invite you to join us as well. And then I'd love to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter. Okay, so thanks, and let's keep the conversation going. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Marcia. Thank you so much, Marcia.
Amazing, Jay. Thank you so much. That was very informative. Love the poll as well. It was really cool to see those responses come in live and to see some of those assumptions tested. So up next, we're going to jump into a little fireside chat to kind of dig into some of these topics in a little bit more detail. We'd also love to take your Q&A. So I see Mariah posted one in the session. For any future questions, please post them in the Q&A tab so we have them all in one place and we don't lose any of them. And also, as you've noticed, we've given you all presenter access. So if you're comfortable, we'd love to see you on camera as well, just so we get a little sense of community here in this event. And if you have a question that you want to ask on camera, we'd love that as well. That'd be awesome. Awesome. Oh, it's so great to see some of you. Thanks so much. All right, so we'll dive into some questions that I had as a follow-up to the presentation. So I think it was very interesting, but it kind of sounded a lot like engagement score, which colleges and universities have been doing for the last 5 or 7 years. And, you know, other nonprofits have tried to score the engagement of their constituents. So Jay, can you share how this is different?
Well, that's a really insightful question, Marcia. I think many of us have become much more data-driven in our work over the last decade, and that is certainly a testament to better understanding our constituents, the way private retail and consumer brands think about their customers. What I would say about nonprofits and higher education in particular is that as we've done these scores or tried to create these scores in our databases or hired a consultant to score our database, we often are not bringing in direct information from our constituents. And that is really important if you're trying to get to the level of connection or identity that a donor or alum or constituent has with your cause. So think about it this way. If you were to go into your database and score your database and create something new, you're really just reflecting what you already know in a different way. You're creating what's called a data mask. So you've got a new score that just aggregates a whole bunch of information you already had in your database. You know, that doesn't really do a lot for you because it probably doesn't respond to institutional intervention quickly enough for you to be able to make different business decisions. So think about the way with any retail brand, you exit Target, you buy something, maybe a day or two later or an hour or two later, you get a survey question about what you bought. We do not solicit that type of feedback routinely from our constituents, and that's what's missing from the engagement score. And for those of you who have been using engagement scoring for a long time, you might be nodding your head or saying, geez, that kind of makes sense. Like, the score really hasn't changed in the last 5 years. So what good is a score if it doesn't respond to institutional intervention and take into account data sourced directly from your constituents? That's the difference in my view.
That's a really great clarification. Thank you, Jay. I'm curious what you think the role of community events play in donor identity, and how have you seen the shift over COVID?
Well, one of the fundamental dimensions, that third dimension of identity that I talked about, is social. It's about the community. It's about you and your peers who share the same identity as, let's say, a Stanford graduate and fellow Stanford graduates, or blood donors and other blood donors. You know, the part of community the role that it plays in identity is to reinforce expectations. So I think it's really critical that we do not lose sight of the community organizing component of what we do in nonprofit fundraising, because without modeling within a community donor behavior, it's much more difficult to get an individual to become a donor or to continue giving. So to say that another way, we want to orient those supporters that are very close to our cause in communities where they have a chance to model that behavior for others. And it turns out, at least according to role identity theory and social psychology, that when you put someone in a group and they model a positive behavior, that actually extends much more quickly when you yourself are putting together that cause versus just expecting that organization to happen organically. So community building is still very important. What I would say about that is it doesn't have to be in person. If we've learned anything over the course of this last year and a half, it's that to make something personal doesn't mean it has to be in person. So we can create community in many different ways. It doesn't have to just be a homecoming event or, your annual nonprofit dinner fundraiser gala. Gosh, I'm so tired of people complaining about, the chicken or the beef or the fish. Let's just get over the color of the napkins and everything and build community in ways that, allow those donors to model behavior for their peers.
Absolutely. I love that. I think, like with the world of virtual, there's so much more that you could do, and there's so many more ways that you could bring people together from around the world. You're not confined to just the one region. And there's some really creative things that you could do. So really cool to hear you say that as well. As an alumni relations professional yourself, I'm curious how you measure the success of your programs. Are there any KPIs that you look at, or what's challenging about measuring success in your role?
I think one of the most challenging things for higher education and nonprofits in general is to translate the things we count into things that are actually business intelligence metrics. So let me just give an example. You all may remember an abacus. This is one of the standard toys for little kids now. And my son, when he was little, had this great multicolored abacus where he would just, move the beads from left to right, maybe count things. Many times that's all our KPIs or metrics are. And we have to recognize that. If you are just counting something, like you're counting the number of people who come to an event, you're counting the number of people who responded to a solicitation. As one of my friends would say, as a mathematician, when you count something, all you really do is confirm that it exists. It doesn't tell you anything beyond that. So we have to have metrics that respond to institutional change and that actually give us directionality when we look at them. So to look at last year's event and this year's event and to count more or less or fewer attendees, it really doesn't give you anything actionable, and it doesn't tell you anything more than the fact that there were a greater number or fewer people in the room or in the virtual event. So the KPIs that I like, the metrics that are meaningful to me, they kind of have to check 3 boxes. The first box they have to check is they have to be meaningful. And I think you all know what those are in your space. So take those metrics that just don't really mean anything and throw them out. So it has to be meaningful. That's the first box. The second box is it actually has to be measurable. So take the discipline to understand if you are actually measuring the thing that you want to measure. A great example of this would be donor retention. I mean, really look at the way you measure donor retention. And are you just counting if somebody did something one year and then the next, or over the last 3 years? Make sure you've got the measurement right. Okay, so don't take the measurement part for granted. And the third thing it has to do is it has to respond to institutional change, which means if you were to change something significant about your strategy or significant about the budget and where you put your dollars, this metric, this KPI should move. It should move. So if you've got a metric that isn't that meaningful, or the measurement is outdated, and you could upend your whole business model and it wouldn't change, that's a poor KPI. So spend some time in brainstorming with your colleagues about finding a metric that would be really meaningful to your work, where the measurement, you've looked at it, and it's really measuring the thing that you think it's measuring. And the third, that if you were to change something significant about the way you do your work, that this metric would change too. That's what I mean by respond to institutional change.
That's really phenomenal advice. Thank you so much, Jay. Well, I think, this has all been great and we have some really good answers, but I do want to get back to the root of the matter and, the big question that we posed at the beginning of this event and throughout this event. Why do some people give and others don't? And is there even anything that we could do about it?
Well, the question is meant to be a little rhetorical and to invite us all to think about this business that we've dedicated our professional lives to. Of course, we feel like there are things that we can do to encourage folks who are not supporters now to become supporters later. I think the number one thing that would help us in that journey is often ignored, and that's the concept of losing and losing early. I think one of the best things that we can do as engagement professionals is have metrics that help us understand who among our constituents are just never going to become great, consistent donors. And metrics that would allow us to identify those folks and to divest from them. So, I think it's hard because a lot of us care about the causes that we work for. And at least in higher education, it's very difficult to think about any number of alumni just never really caring enough to give back. I just want to say for the record in the recording, that is okay. Alumni don't have to do anything else other than graduate in order to belong to their alumni community. But if the best thing that most alumni can do is give to support their alma mater, then we have to be honest and say that if there are folks who don't want to do that, that's okay too. I think our business just does a pretty poor job of allowing ourselves the, I don't know, what's the right word, the grace to bow out of constantly hitting some alumni over the head, expecting their identities to change. Because as we talked about today, identities are formed over time. They're not easily lost. And so if somebody graduated 10 years ago and doesn't really identify with Mississippi State, that's okay. Let's allow them to go about their journey, and let's focus on the people for whom a big part of who they are is the fact that they attended their alma mater. So I would close out on that, Marcia. It's just very important that we start to think about how we can narrow the focus of our work to broaden its appeal. And part of that is to recognize that there are groups of constituents who will just never be great donors, and that's okay. Let's take the limited resources we have, focus on a metric that works, and do what we can to build strategies that appeal to their identities and make that the bedrock of our fundraising activity.
That's really phenomenal advice. I'm thinking through my own journey as an alumnus of my business school, and they've been I was very proud to go there, and they've been reaching out to me for years to become a donor, and I personally wasn't ready to take that step. But when I was reached out to on a different level to participate in an alumni panel, this was I think 10 years after I graduated, that was an opportunity that really spoke to me. And that's how I first got re-involved, I would say. And I've been involved ever since, donating my time, making introductions through my network, looping in other alumni that were part of my class. So it's really interesting how, through different ways of reaching out to people, you can have some really interesting results there as well. So I'd love to jump into some of your Q&A. I see a couple of questions submitted, and I see some of you here on camera as well. So Mariah, I'll start with your question. You had a question around effective ways to maintain identity. Do you want to come off mute and share your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having this. I was wondering, especially when you work in causes that are very specific. I've worked with organization that focuses on African literacy. And it's always this push and pull of when we're creating an event or any kind of interaction, how focused do we make it around books and literacy and the people who we're serving, as opposed to just making it a great time and building community among the other donors. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
That's a really great question, Mariah. Thank you. And what's the name of your organization?
The one I'm thinking of is called the African Library Project.
Awesome.
It's a great organization.
Well,
Can all check it out.
Thank you for that important work. Boy, this is a fascinating question, isn't it? And I think about it quite a bit being here in the Bay Area, where there are no shortage of causes and no shortage of donors, presumably. You know, when I first got into this business of engagement and fundraising, Mariah, it kind of felt like a meal plan to me because we just seem to be feeding people all the time and having dinners all the time and meetings all the time. And I guess I would challenge the concept that one of the things donors look for from us is an opportunity to gather with people like them. Now, let me put this in the context of higher education for a minute. Reunions used to be a huge part of higher education fundraising, and now no longer so. And some people have said, well, that's because the class sizes in college are so much bigger now, and some other reasons. But the reality is that an alum doesn't need their alma mater to connect with their fellow alumni around any shared interest any longer. That need does not exist because it's easy for anyone to go online and find people like them from their university who care about the things they care about. So I would say that the pull for donors to be organized by a cause just so they can be together and talk about the cause isn't as strong as maybe it used to be. What I think these gala dinners and other events can really do is bring the cause closer and more in front of donors than you can in marketing communications. So the example here is, instead of having a homecoming that's focused around gathering alumni according to their 50th class reunion, now we're seeing homecomings that gather alumni around a particular cause where the students themselves and the cause is the attraction. So for example, at the homecoming that we just hosted at UC Berkeley back in October, we partnered with the Cal Alumni Association to do a first generation alumni reunion. And so that crossed all different kinds of class years, but it put the students front and center in a cause that had a direct relationship to alumni and donors. So my suggestion, because I can't solve this for you here, but my suggestion is to really take with a grain of salt any anecdotes about how much donors love to get together and have, feel fancy and do fancy things, and think more about how can we get this literacy component, African American literacy, into the forefront of our events. How could we invite speakers? How could we showcase authors, for example, and try to make the event at the core of the cause itself. And I'm happy to chat with you more about that offline. That's a phenomenal question, though. Thank you, Mariah.
Incredible question. Great advice as well. Thank you, Jay. All right, so I see a couple more folks here on screen. I'm wondering if Jessica, do you have any questions for Jay?
I do.
Hey, Jessica.
Hi. So, as you know, I don't always agree with you on the letting go of alumni with grace. So,
Yes.
I always think about like that alumna from the class of 1945 who has never responded to a single solicitation, but leaves you $1 million bequest in her will, or someone who, something outside of our control happens, their identity grows, and they don't have a tool, to make a gift to the university. So I do agree like on the number side, but then when we get to like the actual, these cases where we're proven wrong, sometimes it makes me question it a bit. Reaction.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, my reaction in real time. Yeah, I think anecdotes are such a powerful part of our business because they haven't quite, um, we have not quite allowed data analysis to trump an anecdote. So when you hear something about, the alum who never engaged until they were involved in their 50th reunion, and you start to build this narrative that that's true for a lot of other people, when in fact it's the anecdote about one person. And what the data might show is that for most people in that class, they haven't attended their 45th or 40th or 35th reunion, so why would we expect the 50th to be any different? So my reaction is just to reflect that we really have two sources of input for making business decisions in our work. One is data, and the other are anecdotes. And anecdotes can be really powerful, and I think those are sort of treated unequally right now in our business. I don't want to deny the truth of what you said, Jessica, which is that there are a lot of donors who live in joyful anonymity until some point or something happens. And sometimes sometimes I feel like there's nothing we can do about it. Other times I think that had we been able to assess the identity of that individual who you mentioned, if we had a survey that went out routinely trying to grab and ascertain the level of connection that she had to her alma mater, then we may have looked at her as a donor differently. I think the challenge is that sometimes there are people who don't want to come to events, they don't want to volunteer, they don't open your emails, and so they're never on the radar. I'm suggesting that being able to do some of this survey work, being able to build identity scores and use those as a measure of engagement might lift some of those folks out of joyful anonymity. So thank you for the question. I hope you noticed that I've been drinking coffee out of my University of San Francisco branded mug this entire time. Thank you, Jessica.
Very nice. That's so cool. I love seeing your reaction kind of live. Awesome. Hi, Temmie. Hopefully I'm saying your name right.
You are. I'm in Montreal, and I'm on campus, so my internet is very weird. So apologies if that occurs. I'll just pop into the chat. But I did want to pick up on the thread from Jessica because I'm in alumni relations at Concordia University here. And over the past couple of years, some of the work that I've been doing with my team is around affinity engagement. So, Black alumni, Asian alumni, Indigenous alumni, thinking about those pieces. And to a certain extent, it's been an interesting road because often actually their identity has to, or their identity and their engagement with the university ebbs and flows. So perhaps they did not have as good a time when they were on campus. And so their reasons for wanting to engage are a little different, and all of that is also, interrogated or by how the university behaves. So if the university is a little bit more honest about history on its campuses. So is this something that you've been looking into, Jay, or have you worked with any of kind of that piece? Could you share a little bit more on that and how that, works in terms of alumni engagement, fundraising, et cetera?
Well, that is such a fascinating question. Thank you very much. And, earlier I said that alumni don't have to do anything other than graduate in order to belong to the alumni community. I think that's a great statement. I don't think it's actually true for many of our alumni. I think for many alumni of color and other minoritized communities, disabled alumni, LGBTQ alumni, they have not felt like they belonged to the community to which they are entitled to belong. And more often than not, and this is true of public and private universities, we expect those communities to find their own way back to connecting to their alma mater versus standing up activities, or as you mentioned, Temmie, honest and vulnerable communications that make it easy for alumni of color, for instance, to reconnect with the campus. So I've been thinking about this stuff a lot, and UC Berkeley is not immune to it. If I could just go back to my research for a little bit, share something that you might find intriguing. For a number of the schools that I've worked with to do these alumni identity assessments or studies, we've often looked at race and ethnicity to understand the relationship between alumni identity and those features. And so what's been surprising, even at some of these larger, more remote liberal arts colleges in the Midwest or in the Northeast that I've worked with, what's surprising is that often alumni of color report, on average, even higher levels of identity with the institution than their white peers. So to say that another way, at a predominantly white small liberal arts college in the Midwest, we found that even though alumni of color was a small percentage of the overall population, when surveyed, they ended up reporting a higher level of identity or connection to the campus. However, that identity was not translated into support behaviors like event attendance, volunteering, or giving the way it is for their white peers. So again, setting aside any anecdotes, just look at the data. What does that mean? It means that this small liberal arts college that has not had a history of being terribly integrated actually has an enormous cohort of alumni of color who deeply identify with the institution, but for whom none of the college's events, volunteering opportunities, or causes, or giving causes, particularly resonate. So that's an enormous gap, but boy, is that also an opportunity. And so if you put staff and resources behind that, try to understand, well, what does this deeply engaged group that doesn't ever show up actually want from their institution? That's ground zero, I think, Temmie. That's where you start. I'd love to talk with you more about this in the context of your work at Concordia, but what you've reflected in your question is 100% true. And it's one of my hopes in using data like this that we're able to bring some of that equity into our business, because it doesn't exist.
Much. And just as a quick corollary to that, we found alumni with accessibility issues actually were able to engage so much more during the pandemic, because all of a sudden most of us dropped regional programming, everything was open to everybody, and that was also an area that we were not generally as good on in the past in terms of making sure everybody could have access. But thank you, this is really fascinating, and I've read some of your work, so thanks for the session.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for sharing that. That is very encouraging, and I'm curious to find out now at Berkeley.